Hello, so today we're going to be going over some extra item tips and tricks. These are going to be some extras, some clarifications on the item guides on my channel. So if you like my content, I normally do TFT guides that I publish daily. Tomorrow we're also going to be going over patch notes and then do a patch notes review and best comps guide in the upcoming days. So if you like that style of content, make sure to like and subscribe. But like I said, this is a continuation of this little 3-part item guide series. If you're new to the game or you will have any questions about items and how to like optimize or build around them, this is a really great starting point, and I work on one of these every single set, so this is the set 15 version. So today what we're going to be going over, also subscribe to the VOD channel, by the way. That's another little thing. 1,000 subs, we do a VOD channel RP giveaway. Anyways, so this video, I'm just going to go over some extra little tidbits of knowledge drops that I kind of talked about in some of those videos, but I want to clarify and give you some practical examples. We're just going to very lightly, very easily just go through some topics, go to the board, draw it out, show you guys some tips and stuff, and then go back and forth like that. First thing I want to clarify is item economy. It's a term that I bring up a lot, and I tried to define it throughout the other presentation slides, but basically item economy is just a way of saying that you're using your components effectively. You want to use your components without burning ones that are really important. You want to be able to make 3 good tank items and 3 good damage items. So when you're making items or when you're deciding on what to make, what you make and your leftover components becomes really important in order to properly deal with whatever's coming your way or whatever you're trying to play around. A really good example that I like to show is usually between mana generation. A lot of times like blue buff is something that is usually greeted towards, or even AP items, right? If you have an AP carry, right? Let's say you have a Syndra. And maybe you want to play around Karma. You know, you heard that Karma's best item is maybe blue buff over Shojin if you're thinking about one of the mana generation items. We'll talk a little about this in a second with mana gen, but a lot of it comes down to item economy when you have to decide what to make. You know, you could decide if you're in a good spot to greed that you'll spend 2 whole tiers on a blue buff, but a lot of times you'll see people make like instantly, they'll have a sword in a tier, right? Or they'll have sword tier, and they'll rather than make blue buff, you'll actually make Shojin. And a lot of it is based on item economy, right? In order to make sure that you have decent tank items and decent carry items, this tier is a lot more useful than sword. It can make a really powerful item for your comp, right? There's really good items like Protector's Vow that are great on frontline. It can make a Shiv, which is a great backline item as well. It's a very expensive, it's a very important item for your comp. So a lot of times when you burn items to make like one particular item, it could be a little bit awkward later. Another example we can take is with AD, for example. Right, let's say we have an AD carry, and let's say we're trying to decide between having a certain amount of components. Let's say we have sword, and then we have like glove, and I don't know, something else, right? A lot of times, like when you see sword, you might think, okay, I'm just gonna make a Deathblade and call it a day. The thing about Deathblade is that it's very expensive because you're using 2 sword components to make items that may or may not be like perfectly good or have good synergies, right, with whatever else that you're trying to play around. Additionally, you're left over with components that maybe aren't the best, that might not be able to make into something useful for your team. For example, like in this case, we might be left over with a glove. Then we're trying to make another backline item. What do we make it with glove? You know, Last Whisper, it's like kind of okay, but it's not really a damage item. You can make a guard breaker, but without an IE, it's not very good. If you're using your bows, remember we talked about like bow drop. If you're using 2 of the same components, we talked about that in our first guide of how item components work. We're less likely to get a sword drop in the future, so it's going to be hard to make IE. It becomes a little bit cluttered. A little bit of a safer choice a lot of times when you start with these type of components is something like slam IE play around sword, because now we have a potential like huge amount of different items, right? There's units like Jinx who really like to have Shojin or is really good with Shojin, so we can use that second sword to make a second Jinx item, right? We can make Shojin IE instead of having to play around glove, and then we have like a really coherent, nice build. Or we can use that sword to make something else. We can make a Giant Slayer, right, which is another really great item that you can make on the current patch. But that's just like part of it, right? That's something that you just want to consider or think about whenever you're slamming your components. It's why I always say whenever I'm talking about items or I'm ranking items or I'm discussing them, I'm like something like a Rabadon's or a Deathblade. These are hard sells for item economy, because unless you really need to make them or you have an excess overflow of the components that use these particular items, then it's just gonna be like you're gonna like make an AD item and then you're just gonna be left over with a bunch of useless shit that you're gonna have trouble to actually make like 3 proper items for your carry or 3 proper items for your tank. Additionally, if you have items that you might be able to play around, note which items are also able to make frontline and backline items, right? In a similar example, if let's say I had like a Gnar, and let's say I already had like a bunch of items, right? Like, let's say we have something like this, maybe we're playing around Ashe or something like that, and then we still have like, maybe we have the potential to make, let me show an example. Like, we have this, and we have something else, right? Sometimes in these cases, right, you might look at them, maybe bow is a bad example. Maybe we'll take like a rod, right? Like, there's different ways that you want to try and arrange your items to make frontline items in addition to your backline items, right? Chainmail's really great at turning items into frontline items, but you also want to keep the options open to understand like what is a potential to make a frontline item. So like in a lot of cases, depending on what you do, right, here you might want to just slam IE, but if you slam IE, you have the chainmail to play around, so that gives you the option to make a frontline item later. If you don't have an item slam, sometimes it's good to just like use these components, even though they might turn into a backline item, balance it by making a frontline item as well. It really depends on your spot, but you always want to keep like components that are a bit weird, like glove. Steadfast is a decent frontline slam. Chainmail can turn a lot of things into items. So if you have leftover AP items and you're playing AD, you can make frontline items that way. It's something that just you want to keep track of, and that's like the whole basis of item economy. Now, obviously, I did a lot of other examples during the other presentation, but like I said, I just wanted to clarify it a little bit. Next, I want to talk about item prioritization. So item prioritization is pretty important. Basically, what this deals with is just which items are most important for your carries. And it really depends on the carry. We'll use some forecast examples just because they're a little bit easier to like give an example with, right? If I look at these different units, right, what are we prioritizing with AP units, right? AP units, if they're casting an ability, and that is the main way that they do damage, usually you're prioritizing some sort of mana gen and some sort of damage item, right? Typically you'll hear people like, there's all these like TikToks, it's like how to make items, mana, attack speed, this, done. It's like, instead I like to talk more about it in terms of diminishing returns, which I did in my item guides. I think that's a more long lasting skill instead of making like a fake checklist like that a lot of the times. But what you normally want on an AP unit is usually some sort of mana gen is usually the most important, because obviously you need to get the cast off because that's where all their damage is, and you need some sort of way of scaling up their damage, and that's usually based on how they get sources of damage, right? So Karma, for example, being a Sork and having a mana threshold that's pretty nice. She doesn't have that much attack speed. Blue buff is really good, and then you want to maybe give her crit, right? We talk a lot about JG because she already has a lot of base stats, right? If she has base stats and we make them crit, we're multiplying her damage output. So usually when you're prioritizing Karma items, you're prioritizing at least one tier item to make sure that she can cast, and then you're focusing on damage items, preferably crit. So depending on your spot, if I'm playing Karma and I don't have a single tier, this is a comp that loves to have tiers, you're prioritizing taking a tier on Carousel to make sure that you have your mana generation. You always want to make sure you have some sort of mana gen, because tiers are great, especially in AP lines, because even in the worst case scenario, you can still make frontline items out of them, like a Protector's Vow. You can make another backline item that is really useful, which is a Shiv. So no matter what your AP line is, tiers are usually really important components. And when you're prioritizing items, you want to make sure that you prioritize having your mana gen, because your unit won't function correctly unless it has mana gen. And you're also hoping to have some level of crit, or any sort of, like in this case, crit, because it's an AP that gets a bunch of AP from Sorks. Other units, like Ashe, for example. Ashe is an auto attacker, right? When you have an auto attacker, what do you want? You want some means of attack speed. Ashe has insane scaling because she also scales with attack speed, in particular, AS, right? You can see the arrows that she shoots scales with the amount of attack speed that she has. I believe that they're removing this later. I'm pretty sure tomorrow's patch will go over it, but I've heard the whispers that this scaling is getting removed as of the next patch. But when you're thinking about Ashe, she's an auto attacker. So when you're an auto attacker, you really, really need the attack speed. Attack speed is one of the most important things that you're going to want on the unit. So you need to make sure that you prioritize having at least one Guinsoo. You're going to take components that make that Guinsoo component, because it works really well with Ashe in particular. There's other auto attackers that you might not necessarily need a Guinsoo. Kale, for example, prefers to just have more upfront damage, just because she doesn't scale as well in the mid game, and then by the time you make it to level 9, you just hit like a truck anyways. So stuff like this works really well, which we'll talk about in a slide or two. But in general, when you're prioritizing items, it comes down to what are the key items for this unit. And it takes a little bit of practice, and it takes a little bit of getting to know the comp, but a lot of times I will mention if the items are really important when I do guides on my channel about the comps in particular. It's just something you have to kind of understand, but usually units fall into archetypes, right? If you have an auto attacker or attack marksman or whatever, typically attack speed paired with another item that scales with attack speed well is going to be the prioritization. And then similarly, you can have an attack caster. Jinx right now does a lot better with Shojin. It's kind of like she goes back and forth. Does she want attack speed? Does she want Shojin? Does she want 3 damage items? Like, it's either 3 damage items. Usually you're prioritizing IE as one of her better items just to make her ult crit. But a lot of times it's just like either triple damage item or Shojin damage. Those are things that you have to consider whenever you're looking at your unit. What is the most important thing for this unit? And a lot of times you can determine that using like a principle like diminishing returns or carry stacking or stuff like that I introduce in the item guides. But there's also a level of prioritization of what's most important, right? If I was playing Jinx and I didn't have IE, like maybe Giant Slayer now is broken enough that you just slam it instantly, but I wouldn't be prioritizing, oh, I need to make a Kraken or I need to make a Guinsoo on Jinx. It's like these are things that are potentially less important than giving her like a huge amount of upfront damage, which is what you normally want, right? I wouldn't like go out of my way to say, oh, I'm prioritizing Last Whisper on Jinx. A lot of times you have Sky Pierce if you're not going Gather Force, right? And if you're going Gather Force, then you need to prioritize a mana gen because it gives her so much AD. It's stuff like that where it comes down to like how you're playing around the comp, how you're playing around the fruits, and if the unit is flexible, how you kind of fill in the gaps based on your diminishing returns principles. Next, we're probably going to talk about mana generation. So mana generation, I think, is the part where it's like a little bit fuzzy. There's different mana items for different units. Typically, it's down to a couple of things, right? So let's take out some karmas and let's go through it. With mana generation, a lot of times you're either making a Shojin, right? That is one of the mana generation tools. You're making a blue buff, or you're making an adaptive helm. So if we're looking at these items, usually blue buff is better on most units just because it has this extra effect of giving you additional attack damage and ability power. Now, when you're looking at blue buff, it gives 5 mana regen. When you're looking at Shojin, it gives you 1 mana regen and attacks grant 5 bonus mana. Now, Shojin and blue buff will be approximately the same amount of mana generation between the two of them. However, Shojin is required Shojin requires some attack speed in order to be as good as blue buff. So blue buff will give you 5 mana per second. If you're attacking once per second or you have 1.0 attack speed on the unit, then Shojin and blue buff will basically generate around the same mana. So a lot of times, the way you can decide between Shojin and blue buff is that you usually look at the attack speed of the unit. If the unit has enough attack speed that Shojin is worthwhile, then Shojin will generate more mana and it's often better. However, the stats that blue buff gives is just better stats. It's a little bit more of a greed item. So usually it comes down to item economy. So, as much as I can say what the optimal is, blue buff is optimal with lower attack speed. Shojin is optimal with more attack speed. Usually it comes down to item economy. That's why I talked about it before. If you could afford to make blue buff, it's usually a good decision to make blue buff for most of the caster units. But if you cannot afford the 2 tiers, you're basically killing 2 tier components. It's making it hard to make shred. It's going to make it hard to have frontline items. Tiers are really flexible. They're really great to have. You have lots of options open, and swords, they're not like that. They are a lot worse, and especially in an AP line, it's an AD item. It's an AD item and you're playing AP. It's like, what are we doing here? It's a little bit difficult to deal with. So a lot of times you'll just see Shojin slams very early on a karma instead of greeting for blue buff. Unless you have like replication or something like that, typically something works out like this. Or if you don't have any other use for the tiers, maybe you're playing Smolder, right? Smolder blue buff is a lot easier to make because it's the opposite effect, right? If you're playing Smolder, for example, where's Smolder? Smolder, you never ever make Shojin with Smolder usually, because the sword is so important because you're usually dual carrying Darius. Like, what are your Darius items going to be? You need the sword. It's like item economy in the opposite way, right? Darius can use every single sword item, right? Like, this is fine on him. 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 This is fine on him, right? Like, you don't want to waste your sword items because you have an AD carry that needs the swords. So then you just like, if you have to make Shojin later, you can, but you'll typically just like leave the Smolder alone and then eventually make a blue buff because you don't need the extra tiers, right? It's stuff like that where it matters between what you're playing, and that's where you make the decision. The odd one out typically is Adaptive Helm. So Adaptive Helm is kind of weird, right? It gives you some mana regen, 2 mana regen, which is nice, and then you gain additional mana from all sources. Tanks and fighters gain extra mana, which is great. So Adaptive Helm is typically something you'll see on a frontline unit that likes to cast, or just for like some extra tank stats on the front line. So typically you'll see it more in a frontline case. In backline, it gives you AD and ability power. It's not that strong, but it does give you extra mana gen. So sometimes it works well with like different traits. Like, you know, you can imagine with Prodigy that gives you mana generation. Adaptive Helm is going to give you more, so it kind of has a synergy there. But a lot of times it's more of a lesser used backline item because it's not as like clear cut as like blue buff Shojin of like giving you the upfront mana. It kind of like needs you to have like another tier item maybe, and like kind of have like a little bit of a weirder spot. Typically with Adaptive Helm, you only use it for mana generation if you can't make the other ones, especially on this set. Maybe in other sets it's a little bit different because sometimes the thresholding is a little bit better. The other thing with Adaptive Helm is that item economy, it's usually a little bit awkward to make, especially if you're making it as like a backline AP carry, because you're using a tier and a cloak, right? A tier and a cloak are components that are going to be used for a void staff as well as a spark, right? These are your shred components that you're going to need to make to optimize your damage output if you're playing AP. Now if you're playing AD, Adaptive Helm is a great sign. Just slam it, who cares, right? You don't care about these components with AD. But that's why usually when I'm talking about, like, you know, you're new to the game, you're watching a guide, you want to figure stuff out for yourself, you're trying to experiment, I always say err on the side of caution with Adaptive Helm. If you're using it as a backline item, I would be a little bit careful with it. There obviously are some cases where it's good if you're playing like Prodigies and stuff like that. There's maybe some synergies there, but I always say like, hey, you're better off maybe greeting with those components because you can make a better tank item and you can use the tier for a better backline item, which is usually what's more important in both those cases. So but of course, if you're stuck, it is what it is, right? If you have a tier and a cloak and you need a mana generation item, it still exists. And if you're slamming for tempo and you're playing aggressive and you're trying to win streak, then obviously still make it. What I'm just trying to say is like, that's usually what happens with mana gen. It's usually these ones, usually dictated by attack speed. But if you can, blue buff now with the new buffs, it's pretty good on most of the units. So you usually go for blue buff if you have the choice. Next, we have a couple other things. I already talked about item prioritization, upfront versus scaling damage. So this is something that's becoming more and more important as they kind of buff and nerf different items. So for example, depending on what type of carry you're playing, there's like this idea of either upfront or not non-upfront damage, like either upfront or you're scaling. So I'll give an example with Karma. Now this isn't going to be the best example because obviously we talked about diminishing returns, but like an upfront damage build is typically something where you're building around crit and damage amp, and you try to hit everybody like a truck. This is something like a Jewel Gauntlet, Giant Slayer. Additionally, with AP carries, you can sometimes see something like an Archangels. Archangels, it doesn't give you as much damage, right? Jewel Gauntlet, it's going to give you more base stats, and you're critically striking, which means you're going to do more damage instantly, right? Your ult is going to get scaled and do a shit ton of damage. Archangels doesn't have that scaling. Instead, every 5 seconds, you're gaining ability power. So at one point, Archangels will surpass the damage here, but it's like, how long does the fight last? That's what you always have to try and figure out, and usually Archangels isn't that good unless a unit has inherently good scaling or good stats with it, right? Like Archangels is great on Yuumi, for example, because Yuumi gets double scaling, right? Because she launches these pages, which will then scale with the Archangels. So a typical Yuumi build will be something like this. And a lot of times with Yuumi, you had an insane front line because Leona and Cassante would really support you to have a lot of power, right? Compared to like a Karma, you want to kill instantly because you want the Sork proc to happen. That's like upfront versus scaling with AP. Typically, it's dictated by your front line. If you have like an insane front line that's playing around either really good frontline units or really deep synergies, then it's going to make more sense to make a scaling build. But a lot of times, it's usually a debate of if you have enough, because like you kind of imagine it like a graph, right? Or like a line. It's like upfront damage will do more damage at the start, and then the scaling damage will eventually reach a point where it does more damage. But that point is going to be well into the future because all the time that you're doing the upfront damage, you're losing out by having the scaling build. Units that work really well with scaling are, like I said, are ones that usually have like double scaling, right? Like Ashe, for example. You'd always want to build a Gwinsu on Ashe because not only does she stack her attack speed really well, the attack speed that she gets extra not only translates to her doing auto attack damage, but it also increases the amount of arrows that she has. So Gwinsu is like turbo good on her because she's going to gain so much attack speed scaling from it, from both the doing the damage as well as getting the extra arrows to do additional damage. Also, when you build Ashe, a lot of times you're playing with Colossal Udyr, and this unit is tanky enough. This unit is so hard to kill that the Ashe usually gets to a point where she's like critical mass and actually wiping through entire boards. So the scaling build works because your front line can support the scaling. Something that doesn't work as well nowadays is Kayle, right? The new thing with Kayle is that instead of building around Gwinsu, which used to be like the old thing, used to go like Gwinsu crit, right? Now instead, a lot of items got buffed, right? Giant Slayer is really buffed, so it does a lot of damage, and Kayle does so much damage with her waves anyways that you don't really need to scale her. You'd rather just do more upfront damage and kill units, and it's also a lot more stable in the mid game. So a lot of times you'll see builds like this where people will just slam a red buff, and you'll use the rod to make like a jewel gauntlet, and you'll use the bows to make like a Giant Slayer and just make more damage. With this build, the Kayle actually has enough attack speed that she can usually clear out the board a lot easier, especially when you make it to level 9, because she can actually just clear everybody. The other thing that this synergizes with is usually having specific power-ups, right? Obviously, this build, if you're playing Kayle, like one of the big things is like over 9,000 is like a big like check to see if you're strong enough. But if you have over 9,000, now you're gaining the stats here, and a lot of times it's tailored, so you're going to gain some extra attack speed, some extra AP with the attack speed here, and just having starting attack speed with the bow items, right? Instead of waiting for Gwinsu to scale, you're going to have red buff that's going to allow you to do more damage up front, kill some units earlier. If you're killing units a lot faster and you're doing insane damage a lot earlier in the fight, by the time a build with a Gwinsu will ramp up to being the same attack speed as these items that you're using your bows committed towards, a lot of times it works out that this is just going to be better, because Kayle, like I said, when you get to level 9, she's shooting a wave with every attack. She's hitting like a truck, so you'd rather just like have her hit like a truck early, kill units, make your front line have a little bit more ability to sustain themselves because you've eliminated units on your opponent's board, and just kind of work like that. Usually upfront damage is better if you don't necessarily need to scale, or if there's not like good scaling with like the stats themselves, right? Like I gave the example with Ashe and Yuumi where they have really good scaling, so it makes sense in those comps to have some sort of means of generating extra stats. But a lot of the times it's usually a question of those two things, and you have to just decide whether your front line can support it, right? Another example of a scaling comp is Ryze. Ryze loves Archangels because we talked about it before. He has crit and damage amp already, so you really want base AP stats. And usually when you're playing Ryze, you have mentors and mech. So you have like the mentors that are all really tanky and really strong when they get their abilities upgraded. Then you also have the mighty mech and a Jarvan that stuns. The whole board stuns. It stalls out forever. I'm just going to put random mighty mech units. You have the mech which stuns. The mech which lives as an extra frontline. You have this guy that stuns. You have these guys that stun and are extra frontline units. It's just so much utility and just ability to stall out with your front line that the Archangels will get value, and then Ryze can kind of chew through everybody. Ryze also somewhat single target, and having like really good damage and really high stats for single target is usually really important because he needs to chew through everybody as fast as possible. That's like another idea, and usually this all comes down to whether or not your front line can support it or not. Usually if you're playing deep vertical traits, you prefer scaling because you'll be able to make it. So if you're playing like all the Bastion units, or if you're playing like, you know, all the, not Vanguard, what's it called this time, Juggernaut units, right? If you're playing like these vertical front lines or Protector, then it makes more sense to go for those scaling builds. Next we have damage versus utility. So when we're thinking about utility items versus damage items, I always am on the side of, hey, if you're a beginner player, always make sure that you have your utility. Treat it like a little checklist. So like, you know, if I'm trying to build a unit, well, maybe not, maybe Kayle's not a good example. Let's say Syndra, you know, I always mention, I'm like, hey, you know, maybe consider, you know, making your Void Staff if you're playing AP. Also consider making your Morello if you're playing AP, right? Anti-heal, Shred, Sunder. These are things that are really important, right? Anti-heal basically reduces the amount of healing units do. So all these units, especially tanks, they have effects where they heal themselves. Reed Rakan, for example, heal. Reed Cassante, for example, he has like a heal, right? Have like, you know, whatever. Like even Poppy I think has a heal a little bit, which she has a shielding. But like usually like between augments or anomalies and other stuff, or augments or power-ups and other things, you want to cut the amount of healing because it makes it easier to kill those units. Additionally, with Shred and Sunder, you want to reduce their armor so that your damage is more effective. These are things that are really important. However, you might ask yourself how important they are. If you ask a better player, they're going to say it's kind of fake. If you ask a really beginner player, they're going to make it seem like it's the most important thing in the world. I say it's somewhere in the middle. It usually, like, as you get better, the way that you determine how important they are is usually based on what your lobby is. So for example, if I'm fighting against an Udyr is a great example because this is like a skill check. Udyr has an insane amount of healing, right? Because his main ability, he has healing. Each attack that he does, especially if you're playing with duelists, he has healing. So usually with 2-star Udyr, this guy is impossible to kill. And then a lot of times you're solo frontlining him with Gargoyle and like items that make him unkillable, right? Like Gargoyle Sterex, which just makes it like, you know, he gets a huge health shield. He has a bunch of armor. He's hard to chew through. This is a unit where anti-heal and Shred or Sunder really starts to matter. So if I'm playing around an AP line or AD line, right? If I'm playing AP, I want to make sure that I have either a Last Whisper or a Spark to make sure that I'm doing some sort of armor reduction. If I'm playing AD, I typically want to make sure that I have a Last Whisper or an Even Shroud just to make sure that I'm chewing through this guy's armor because he has a lot of armor. Additionally, if I'm playing around any of these backline units, I want to make sure that I have either some sort of heal cutting because the Udyr heals a lot. This is an example where it really matters to have these because if there's one in your lobby, you need these types of things in order to function correctly. Additionally, the other problem with Udyr, not Udyr in particular, but the other problem is that like if multiple people are playing around these types of front lines, like if there's multiple Ashe players in your lobby, it becomes even more important to have these. Additionally, you can also look at what you're playing against, right? If you're playing against a capped board where they have like units that heal, like melee style units, you might want to prioritize anti-heal more because if their main carry is a Yone or their main carry is a Volibear, for example, it's going to be really effective and really efficient for you to make sure that this unit isn't healing so they can die faster. If you're killing their main carry faster, that's going to help you win the fight. Additionally, if you're playing a board where they have like a bunch of Bastion units, right? Like let's say they're playing the Bastion Yasuo line, which is becoming a little bit more popular, right? If they're playing Bastions and they have inherently a lot of armor, you're going to care way more about getting through their armor, having armor pen in some way, shape, or form. However, the one thing you have to note is that these items are never going to be more important than having 3 items on a damage on a damage dealer, right? So like for example, like maybe Void Staff is like a pretty good item, maybe Last Whisper has some good synergies with like different builds, but if you're lacking items, you need to make sure that your main carry has damage, right? Like I would never want to have like what's it called, like Morello Last Whisper Jinx. You know what I mean? Like this unit is going to do no damage. So it doesn't matter if you're cutting their healing by whatever percent. It's not like if you're cutting their heal by 33%. It doesn't matter if you're cutting the armor by 30%. If you don't do any damage, 30% damage reduction of nothing is nothing. You know what I mean? Like you need to make sure that you have damage items anyways. So when I say these are really important, that's what I mean. You ask some people, they're going to say they're fake. You ask some people, they're going to say they're important. The main thing that you want to make sure is that you have to balance between having 3 good items, maybe 2 good items, right? So a lot of times with Jinx, if I'm going Last Whisper, I'll make sure to pair with an IE because then it's a little bit better. This gives some crit chance, it pairs well with the IE, makes it more likely for the Jinx to crit. This is something that's going to help me out a little bit more. So now it's like a matter of item economy. This item, even though it's not a heavy damage item, it pairs well with the IE to make sure that my Jinx has a decent crit build going, which can help to increase my damage while also having utility. That's what I usually recommend. But if you can't do that, typically I would prioritize the damage items first unless you're up against like a very clear lobby, right? Like if your lobby has multiple players that you, like if you scout and you're like, I need armor reduction, then you scout another guy, you're like, I need armor reduction, you scout another guy, it's like, I need armor reduction, you scout another guy, it's like, I need armor reduction, only then would I prioritize armor reduction. Instead, I would first prioritize damage items, and then if my components work out that I can make it, it's like it's a nice to have, I'll make it, right? Or I'll slam it early to give myself direction, things like that. But I wouldn't necessarily prioritize it as the first item I make. It would be more like the second or third item that I make, and I would try and manage my items in such a way that I also have components, right? Similarly, I talked about these ones. I said that's why I don't like to slam adaptive helm, right? Because if I'm playing around AP, I want to keep components open in case I can make these in the future. That's like the idea or mentality I would have around these types of items and components. But usually scouting is what's going to help you the most, and that's where I would recommend it. Additionally, we have item popping. So this one's a little bit of a interesting one if you've never seen it before. But let's imagine you have items on a unit and you have another unit on your bench. What you can do, but if this unit is unupgraded, so they're both 1-star, this is your bench, right? This is your main unit. And let's say you have 3 items here. And you have like 3 items here. Right? What you can do is you can put items on the unit on your bench. Then when you upgrade this unit, right? Let's say you upgrade them and they go to 2-star. What's going to happen is all these items will get popped. Whichever unit is on the board. So whichever unit is on the board is going to be the items that you keep. So if you want to switch items on these 2 units, if you put these items on your benched unit, you swap them, then you upgrade the unit to 2-star. Boom. Right? These items are going to pop off. Whichever one's on your bench is going to pop off. That's like very important when people have thieves gloves and stuff like that. A thieves glove will pop up with any item. So let's say you have a unit and they have a thieves gloves. Let's say you have a unit on your bench and then you try and upgrade the unit, right? So let's say I put like, you know, red buff on this guy, right? If I upgrade this to 2-star, then this red buff will pop off and go on my bench. However, if I upgrade this unit, then the thieves gloves will pop off. And this is like a really important thing because it's always the unit that's on your board which is going to get the prioritization of the items. If you don't have enough items on your units, then it will combine them and then it will just be random which ones pop off. But that's a really important trick because sometimes, you know, especially if you have early game carries, either to pop them off or to switch items, you always want to make sure you just put the unit that you want the items, whatever 3 items you want on the unit, make sure that's the unit on your board, because then when you combine them, those are the items that will stay, whichever one is on the board. So you can use that to pop off items, and it's really good for Thieves Gloves, because Thieves Gloves will pop off with a singular item. It won't pop off with components, by the way. It has to be a completed item, but that's how you can get rid of Thieves Gloves, a little extra item guide. Additionally, removers, right? Tips for removers, last thing of the video. You get 1 per stage, right? It's a new thing to the game or in recent history. And you also have to balance using them and saving them. So whenever you think about removers, sometimes it helps to itemize units that are not on your final board. That way you can sell them and save using a magnetic remover. And additionally, you can also hold extra copies of that unit if they are going to be on your final board, because then you can swap them and sell and do that. This is also really important for fruits as well, especially if you have to dig for fruits. It's becoming more and more important that you have specific fruits on specific units, because that's the way the game is getting balanced. It's getting less balanced for like flexible fruits. It's getting more balanced for like this one particular fruit makes this comp particularly great, and you kind of have to force it. So a lot of times, if you have the option, what you can do is you can hold extra copies of units, because then, like, let's say you first put a fruit on Rakan, but you don't want it to be on Rakan. Then what you can do is you can sell the Rakan, get your fruit back, play the Rakan later. It's really important with certain lines where they're really dependent on it. Like, for example, Darius, Jace. If you're fruiting early, like, you really need to save removers to find that fusion dance on Darius, or this comp falls apart very fast, and it's very hard to, like, top 4 with. In my opinion, of course. Stuff like that. That's with fruits, but obviously you can do it the same with item removers. Just buy, sell, make sure that you keep those item removers economy as good as possible. But anyways, thanks for watching. There won't be any more item tips tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to be going through the patch notes, and then after that, the day after, it's going to be the best comps guide. And then after that, I'm still deciding on exactly what we're going to do, but it's going to go back to some sort of either how to play guide or more of like system mechanic type of stuff. But anyways, hopefully it was helpful. This was just like I said, is more ad-libby, a little bit more of like, you know, meandering, just going through all of the extra cases of some of my notes that I had that didn't make it into the final guides, but I just wanted to still put it out there. Thanks for watching. Have a great day and see ya. Bye-bye.